Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good afternoon, everybody. If you could take your seats. My name is Jim Anaya. I'm a professor at the law school here at the University of Colorado Boulder. I teach, conduct research, and do field work in the areas of international human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples. Today is Friday, April 12, 2024. It's 12 p.m. and this is panel number 18004, titled Human Rights Across the Globe, Progressing or Regressing. Before we get started, I'd like to give our land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories of the ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge. Consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd like to mention is that we want to be sure to get a chance, that you get a chance to ask questions. Here's how we'll handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A. We're using a note card system to receive questions from you, the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from our producer, who is in the back there. And please write legibly. If you are a student, please note that with your question on the card. When you finish writing down your question, raise your hand to hand or give back the card to the producer, who will then bring it up to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. I'd like to now introduce our outstanding panelists for this discussion. For more information than what I'm going to give on each of them, you can consult the full bios on the CWA website. First of all, to my left, Hadar Harris is a human rights lawyer and the interim Washington, D.C. director at PEN America, a nonprofit organization that promotes free expression and defends writers and artists at risk. She is also founder and principal of Rights and Justice Consulting, which supports human rights organizations around the world. Hadar has served in a number of other leadership roles in organizations that support freedom of the press and human rights. Also joining us on the panel is Rowena Huh, a senior research fellow at the University of Texas, Austin. She is author of the acclaimed book, Tiananmen Exiles: Voices of the Struggles for Democracy in China. And her interests focus on the nexus of history, memory, and power, and their implications for academic freedom, public opinion, human rights, and democracy. She publishes and speaks widely beyond the Academy. Her op-eds have appeared in the Washington Post, The Nation, The Guardian, The Globe and Mail, and The Wall Street Journal. We're also pleased to have on the panel Sarah Yeager, who is the Washington, D.C. Director at Human Rights Watch, one of the premier and most influential human rights organizations in the world. Before joining Human Rights Watch, she held several positions in the U.S. government, including as first senior advisor on human rights in the chairman's office at the Joint Staff of the U.S. Department of Defense, and as a deputy chief of staff for policy at the U.S. mission to the United Nations in New York. She has also consulted for a number of non-governmental organizations whose work relates to human rights. A warm welcome to all of you to the University of Colorado Boulder. I'd like to ask each of you to provide initial comments, picking up on the theme of this panel, human rights, regressing or progressing. We'll follow that with what I'm sure will be a very lively and engaging discussion. So let's start with you, Hadar.
Great. Thank you, Jim. And it's an honor to sit on the panel with you. I know your work as the former UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights, and so we look forward to a robust conversation among all of us. My name is Hadar Harris. I'm the Interim Washington Director for PEN America, as was said before. And I feel like yesterday it wasn't enough to be on a panel about democratic backsliding. So today we're going to talk about human rights and whether they're regressing or progressing. So my job is to give you the good, the bad, and the ugly, and to lay it out a little bit to kind of form the start for our conversation, and we look forward to a robust sort of roundtable conversation. So the good, and there is good about human rights, right? I went to law school in 1992. And in 1992, as you might remember, right, the world was changing. The Cold War was finishing. There was a lot of movement around human rights, democratic enfranchisement. In fact, this country ratified a couple of human rights treaties that year for the first time. But there was one class in international human rights at my law school, at UCLA Law School at the time. One. That's changed. And we don't measure the good, the bad, the ugly from whether there are classes in law schools, although maybe you and I have measured that sometimes. But one of the things that we can really point to over the past, not just 75 years since the establishment of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but really over the past several decades, is this growth and explosion in adopting and embracing the concepts of human rights, the language of human rights, the fact that we actually say things are human rights, whether we know what that really means or not, is a kind of expansion of the rhetoric, the discourse, the understanding of the fact that every individual has fundamental rights by virtue of being a human being. That's how we define human rights. Those rights are interconnected, those rights are interdependent, and so we talk a lot about a whole array of different rights, but we implement that and we understand that in a variety of different ways today that is different than maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago, and certainly 75 years ago. So as one of the good things I would say is the expansion of the embrace of the language of human rights and even a base understanding of it. Second, I would say is that there is an expansion of human rights law, where 75 years ago we established the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was an aspirational declaration, not binding international law. The international community has, I guess I am laying it out. The international community has taken that aspirational declaration and has created legally binding treaties on a whole variety of different human rights issues and sets of issues, whether it is women's human rights through the CEDAW Convention, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination, of all forms of discrimination against women, or the CERD, which, by the way, the United States has not ratified. Think about that for a minute. Or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the US has ratified. or the Convention Against Torture, or an array of other binding human rights treaties that exist. There is a set of law that exists in the international community that codifies what human rights means. And they do that at the international level, global level, through the UN, but also through regional bodies that also have other kinds of binding treaties and declarations. The third thing that I would point to say as a positive in terms of the good is that we've created institutions that actually support the implementation of that law. So we have a variety of different institutions and mechanisms through the United Nations. I won't go into all of them, but they are institutions that you've heard about and that you haven't heard about, and even by the very charter of the United Nations, human rights is written into it, and they've created mechanisms within the UN, the International Criminal Court, which was only recently established, right, to focus on international criminal law, and a variety of other institutions. Then the last thing I would say is good is that many of these different concepts, the language, the law, and the institutions have helped to really build and reinforce a rules-based international order. Now we get to the bad. That rules-based international order is under threat, right? That might be the ugly, but we're going to go with that. The law and the concepts that I just talked to you about in terms of the institutions don't have enforcement mechanisms. They don't have a lot of teeth, so they may be legally binding, but there's no enforcement army of the UN that's going to come in and say, oh, you actually continue to discriminate against people on the basis of racial discrimination, and we're going to condemn you in some meaningful way. And that's a weakness, and that's a bad, right? In the United States, we don't domesticate human rights in a meaningful way. We don't have a mechanism within our government to do that, like a National Human Rights Institution, a project that I've worked on for a while. That is essential for us to educate people and actually to integrate our obligations. Just as a point of knowledge, the United States has only ratified three of the core international human rights treaties. We are the only nation in the world that has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Think about that. And so that leads us to kind of another bad, which is some people take that language that's now floating all over the place about human rights and say it's empty rhetoric. It actually is meaningless, or it's super hyper politicized. And we see that playing out in a variety of different ways today that other panelists are going to talk about. And then there's the ugly, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the ugly I would leave with everything that's happening today. And with that, I'll leave it to my next panelist to talk about. Did you like that segue?
Yeah. That was nice.
Go,
Yeah.
Sarah.
Sarah, do you want to? Yeah. Rowena asked to go.
Sure. Yeah, I can go. Hi. How many of you were at the Apocalypse Now panel? Oh man, it's like my same argument that I was going to make on this panel. Okay, I'm going to use different words. Yeah. So, as Washington Director of Human Rights Watch, my job is to take all of the human rights abuses in the world that our researchers find. There are a lot. They come into my inbox every day from Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America, domestically America, and go to the US government and sit at the White House, sit at the State Department, sit at the Pentagon, USAID, and try to convince them, policymakers, of how they can do something to stop those human rights abuses and do something good in the world, or how they can stop doing what they're doing that are actually causing human rights abuses in the world. So that's just to give you a sense of how I see the world. I'm sitting in Washington looking at the entire globe of human rights as it pertains to US influence, United States influence. In terms of whether I see human rights progressing or, what's the other word? Regressing. I was going to say depressing. That's not, it's also depressing. regressing. I don't think there's an answer for that. Like, there's no way to measure it, and it also depends on who you are. If you are living in Hungary right now, your human rights tanking. If you're living in Poland, your human rights are tanking-ish. They're getting a little better, okay. There are some places where human rights are being appreciated in ways that they haven't been over the course of decades. So it really depends. Here's what I will say about the trends that I see. I do not see any regression in the desire of people around the world to have their full human rights. That is a continuing desire from every human being. And the appreciation for all of the things that Hadar was talking about, this international rules-based order, that is what I see regressing or waning. So everyone wants their human rights. How we get there is up for debate for a couple of reasons. I'm going to name 3 reasons why I think these things are under threat. I deal mainly with armed conflict and the laws of war. So to add to what Hadar said about all of these human rights conventions and the declaration and the treaties, there's international humanitarian law. It's the laws of war. The US military calls them the laws of the laws of armed conflict, LOAC. These govern how states and armed groups are supposed to fight, which sounds really strange. Like, go at each other, fine, but do it in a way that's humane, or, humane enough. So it allows for war. It allows civilians to be harmed, killed, injured, just not in a way that's like bigger than what you were going after as a military target. So there's all of these are the Geneva Conventions, these are the additional protocols. Lots of this came out of World War II and the horrors of World War II, where the international community said, well, hold up, we need something to govern, we need to put some guardrails up. Now, the threats I see to that, 1, China and Russia, and that is within the United Nations system. They are consistently trying to undermine these laws and rules, including on human rights and in the laws of war, including by saying things like, the United States can't tell us what to do. Look at the Native American population in the United States. You've never reckoned with that. Look at slavery. You've never reckoned with that. Look at discrimination look at your reproductive rights. They have a point. So that's 1. Number 2, young people. Now, I'm not saying that they are ruining the international system. Rather, they are questioning that system, and many of the young people that I meet want to blow it up entirely. This is colonial. The laws of war, they came from a bunch of white men after World War II. We need something different. This worries me because the system that Hadar and I have been talking about protects all of us. If it did not exist, we would be trying to create it. If the UN didn't exist, we would be trying to create it. We need a place where people can go, where states can go and talk to each other instead of blowing each other up. It doesn't always work. It doesn't work as much as we would like it to. But without it, we would be far worse off. Without the laws of war, we would be far worse off. Now, what I don't hear coming from young people, and for those of you who are in the audience and you are young, I'm looking at you because I'm not hearing solutions for what the new system should look like. I'm all for improvement. Don't just admire the problem. Give me some solution. And then 3rd, Gaza. And for those of you who have heard me speak on a panel before, you've heard this, but I am extraordinarily worried about, I was actually feeling quite positive about the laws of war and the progress that many states had made on professionalizing their militaries, on being able to reduce civilian harm, maybe not eliminate it entirely, but reduce it, be more humane as they went to war with each other. I was feeling fairly positive about that on October 6th. Not so much anymore. The US military has made remarkable improvements after 20 years of counterterrorism. Again, they're not perfect. I'm not calling them the gold standard. I'm not saying that the US military is terrific at these things, but there have been really great policy improvements that are super boring that I'm not going to get into, but they're good. They're really good. Then, and they have been training with the Israeli forces. Israeli forces have some of these same remarkable progress on civilian protection, for example. They're not doing it. They've decided not to use those things that they have learned, the improvements, the professionalism. That is a really big problem for the laws of war, because it shows that a state who says, this is an existential crisis, so we're just gonna get rid of those rules. We can do what we want because it's so serious. That means every other state can say, well, ours is serious too. Pakistan recently said, this thing that happened is our 9/11. Israel said, this is our 9/11. That is because the United States, after 9/11, got rid of the rules. It went beyond the rule of law because it said, this is so serious, we have to do something equally serious. So what I'm seeing right now are the laws that protect all of us being undermined. And we're not going to see the results of that for some time, but we will see the results. And the final thing I'll say is that in my job, I've got to make some sort of argument to policymakers for why they should care about human rights and the laws of war. And I can do that in one of three ways. One is legal, which we've been talking about. One is moral. So with US policymakers, this works pretty well, actually, because American values. So we, as Americans, have these values of, of humanity in times of war, of treating everyone with respect and dignity. It's not actually always true, we know that. But appealing to that conscience and moral nature makes a difference. And then the third way is strategic. To say, if you want to win, if you want to continue to be a global power and have influence, then you need legitimacy and credibility, and you need to show that here at home you are abiding by human rights. You need to show that in war you are abiding by the laws of war. And again, I am worried that these threats to the international system are going to make those arguments really hard to make. And they're not going to convince people anymore. And then we're lost, because our policymakers will have no reason to do the things that we want to do on the side of good and light.
Thank you, Sarah. Lorena, we'll hear from you now.
Thank you so much, and I saw so many familiar faces. Thank you for bearing with me this whole morning, starting very early in the morning. I know I have Starbucks, but you are the one who energized me and gave me the energy, and because you also give me hope, not just the younger generation, as I always tell my students, but also collectively as citizens. Yeah, so I've spoken in two panels, right? Superpower, capitalism, finally my thing, human rights with these wonderful ladies, right? So I was wondering, where shall I start and what shall I say? I thought that we talked about the Great Famine already, talk about my early childhood already, all of these examples of deprivation of human rights. And Sarah, I didn't even know that you were from Human Rights Watch. I'm going to speak with Sophie next week in DC. I will be in a panel in Georgetown University, Human Rights in China, from Tiananmen to Hong Kong. And I can testify, Human Rights Watch did not just do the policy thing. Sophie actually protected me when I was about to be detained as a professor of history leaving Hong Kong before I left for the airport when I was detained, and then when I was eventually officially banned as a scholar of Tiananmen from my homeland. Along the way, she was there with me. So I'm so much looking forward to this panel in DC with her, to be with someone who shared the same values and also When the researcher become the researched, when you are studying these topics and you become the victims, you try to raise all these questions and problems to an authoritarian government that killed its people in 35 years ago. I think it's all really ironic in history, right? So 1989, they killed my generation, my peers, when they took to the street in Tiananmen Square and across the whole nation. And as a historian, maybe I hope you'll forgive me to just tell a personal story. The next morning before the massacre, I went back to my school as a teenager kid, terrified, because I live right next to Hong Kong. I can know what happened. And I'm sure you can tell your story about what happened on June 4th or after June 4th on that day. And I was wearing a black armband, the Chinese way of mourning, and my school teacher came over to me and said, if you don't take that off, no one can protect you from now on. I reluctantly hold back my tears, and actually I was reminded of the moment when Mao died. The night when the news came that Mao had died, my parents closed all the windows and doors, then they brought out the only bottle of wine in our home. They were celebrating with their intellectual friends in our tiny living room. And the next day, they took me to the public memorial service. Everybody was crying. At that time, as a kid, I was totally confused why my parents were so happy with their friends celebrating. The next day, everyone in public space was crying, as if like something terrible happened. And then on the morning of that, morning of fear, that after they deployed 200 army, 1,000 army soldiers with AK-47 and tanks against my peers, I was thinking that for 2 generations, we were not allowed to express the basic human feelings of sorrow and joy. After September 11, I was a new immigrant, first generation, studying in graduate school, and my university Toronto, where I did my master and PhD, everyone was saying that go and see a counselor if you feel bothered and trouble. And at that time, I asked my classmates, I said, what does it mean by counseling? I never heard of the word trauma counseling. It became like, okay, they said, if you get hurt, go and talk to someone. I was thinking like ever since I was a kid, later they told me that's what we call trauma, right? Your parents being taken away the moment you were born, in exile, deprivation of food, everything, and later after Tiananmen, you have to lie to survive, right? So this is all make up by the Americans. No massacre. The students grew up, and then there's this violent counter-revolutionary rioters. So this whole massive, centrally controlled propaganda machine, educational system, and then you just follow suit, reciting all those lies. I didn't want to be expelled from school, right? I didn't want to go to jail. In 1989, we all learned to lie to survive, right? I was one of those criticizing the silence of Chinese intellectuals in the post-1990s. But when I became a professor this past 3 years since 2019 in Hong Kong in the unprecedented social movement protecting my students on campus, I kind of switched my role as an adult now. And I realized that if you don't keep your mouth shut, if you don't try to be low profile, I stopped writing op-eds. I declined all media interviews because I have to take care of the kids on campus so that our final limited space would not be taken away by the same regime that blamed the armies in 1989. So what is human rights, progressing or getting worse? I think this is ongoing, right? I'm a Tiananmen scholar, but I'm not just talking about Tiananmen. I'm also a modern China historian. I look at all this generation and generation, things that you grew up with in this country, you were born with. It took generations of prison, freedom, lives, tears, living with fear. And just a few months ago, I was still an associate professor of history, and now I'm so-called senior research fellow, temporary position. What does human rights mean to us the freedom to speak, to think, to write, to believe without fear. Why am I doing? I know, like in Wiki Encyclopedia, they call me courageous. I think my biggest courage came from my fear since I was born. And I do not want the future generation, wherever, to live within that fear. When my book first came out, I spoke in DC State Department. People ask me, Marina, I know what you're saying is important, but why should we care? Human rights in China, but we have all these voters in the United States. We have to bring food to the table. Yes, of course, all of us wanted to bring food to the table, economic interest. But at the same time, in this global village, if our plane got hijacked, the Titanic sinking, you got a business class, I got a window seat, we'll end up in the same place. And everyone was asking, give us an example. Well, when there's an example, it's too late. 2020, COVID. A medical doctor in Wuhan was silenced. He tried to warn us as early as October, November, and he was silenced. He was crucified in the CCTV, the central TV in Beijing. He was made to keep his mouth shut. And as a result of a violation of human rights of one medical doctor in China, it became the violation of human rights of every single human being on earth. And the consequence is still seeing now, ongoing. So it's not just about them, it's also about us. Not just about then, it's also about now. So I think that we are on the same boat now with populism, nationalism globally happening. We need to work together to safeguard human rights and democracy. I ran away from that most powerful authoritarian government that's also the most powerful economic power in the world now. If democracy fails in democracy, I do not know where I can run away. Preserve and protect your democracy, please, for me and for you and for future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rowena, for sharing that compelling story and set of stories, really. And thanks to our other panelists for some very insightful initial comments. I'm drawn to this statement or observation made by Sarah about the youth. And of course, we're at a university where there are a lot of youth, if not in this room. And I tend to start from the position that the youth have a lot of wisdom that maybe not present itself so obviously initially, but if we take the time to think about what the youth say, maybe ask a few more questions, we'll find that wisdom. And it strikes me that given what each of you have said about the ugly or bad, about what's happening in Gaza, the disregard of international humanitarian law, what has and still has been happening in China, and the anti-democratic trends that we see, that maybe the skepticism that we see among the youth is warranted. What about that? Is it the case that the international human rights system, as Hadar so aptly laid it out for us, is really ineffective? And if so, what's the source of that ineffectiveness? Is it because it's Western-oriented, as many have said? It was created, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the initial human rights instrument, was developed in 1948 at a time when the United Nations was mostly Western countries, Europe and the US and a few other Western countries, Canada and so forth. Is it because of a Western orientation to the rights? Is it because we have I'm already getting questions, and several of them have to do with enforcement. Is it simply because there is no, as Hadar said, any effective enforcement mechanisms? What other reasons might there be for this ineffectiveness that we see and that each of you have touched upon to one extent or another? And how can the world, we in this room, as part of the global community, address that? So, Sarah.
Okay, so I'm going to take a position of pushing back on all that. I agree with you, mostly, that it's kind of a mess. It's a big mess. However, there are 180 some countries. I can't keep up. Some go away. Some new ones are formed. 186, something like that. How many people in this room? Let's say there were 186. What are we going to have for lunch? What if somebody took somebody else's chair? What would we do? There might be a big fight. We might have a consensus. We might do surveys or polling. The United Nations is a place to come and have those disagreements. But this is a bunch of countries that have millions of people. They're gonna have different interests, and their interests are going to butt up against each other. So we would love to see a resolution calling for peace in a place have some teeth, right? And actually make everything okay. It's not going to make everything okay. But the point is that most of the countries of the world have said we want to see peace, or we want to see humanitarian aid, or we believe a peacekeeping mission is important over here. So I struggle to figure out what a better system would be among states who are not beholden to each other, but beholden to their people, and not always well run, for sure. I would also say that with regard to the Western orientation, the United Nations, when it was set up and the UN Charter was signed in San Francisco, tons of African countries there. Yes, the world has been Western dominated. Yes, there is colonialism, all of these terrible things. But other nations, non-Western nations, were involved in this creation. And the laws of war in particular come from almost every culture on the planet. So when I hear people say, well, that doesn't represent the global South, really? Because in Africa, you look back at the old proverbs, don't kill women, don't kill children, don't kill religious figures. That's international law. That's the laws of war. And you can find those things in every culture on the planet. So I sometimes struggle to see which laws we think should not apply because of a particular culture.
Yeah, those are important points. In fact, it was a woman, Eleanor Roosevelt, that led the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the committee did include people from what we call now the Global South. The committee that drafted Ambassador Malik from India, I believe, or Lebanon, sorry. And so a lot of what we might assume or hear, we need to dig a little deeper, right, into what has actually happened. And I do think, this idea that human rights is Western oriented, there is some basis in that. If we look at the way the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted and the way human rights treaties are developed today, they do have much more, human rights treaties developed more recently have much more of a multicultural flavor to them. We see a trend now towards addressing collective rights, the obligations also of communities, of families, as opposed to the highly individualistic orientation that the Universal Declaration has, at least in some respects. Hadar, you look like you wanted to weigh in here.
Yeah, I'll say, look, the fact is, everybody wants food, right? Everybody wants health. Everybody hopes that their kid's going to be educated in some way or another. And so even the youth want that, whether they complain about going to school or not. But the youth are expressing their skepticism through using human rights language. And so their lack of faith in structures and institutions I think, we can understand on a lot of different levels, but the fundamental commitment to human rights, I deeply believe that young people believe in human rights as a concept, as a frame, in a way that my generation didn't even know how to talk about it. And so I think that there's actually a lot of hope with young people. In terms of the arguments around, and I would relate that, idea of we all want basic, fundamental human rights to applying to a critique around the Western orientation of human rights as well. I think that what Jim says about collective rights and really understanding the differences between collective rights versus individual, I think is really important. And I do agree that there's been kind of an evolution in understanding and recognition. And that's interesting to think about in the overlay of the moment that we live in and how that can and should apply. But I'll leave it there. The last thing, though, that I want to say about ineffectiveness or effectiveness and ineffectiveness is, the UN structure was built on, or the UN human rights systems are political systems. And even though a part of the UN human rights system is supposed to be above politics, is supposed to have independent experts who work as special rapporteurs or who sit on committees of independent experts who oversee the implementation of specific human rights treaties. The fact is that it's all based on political will. States, and we call them states, they're not like the state of Colorado, it's the state of the United States, right? They're state parties to these conventions and treaties. A state decides what they're going to implement, and it's highly political in terms of what they decide to implement. A core concept of human rights that I mentioned a minute ago is all human rights are interdependent and indivisible, right? But it's kind of like, when I had kids and I also had a high power job and everybody said, oh, you can't do it all. And somebody said, well, you can do it all, but sometimes you can't do it all at the same time, right? And so in terms of how we decide which human rights are implemented when, those are political decisions. And there's always sort of a balancing of rights that's fundamental to the entire concept of the human rights. I was going to say order, but I think that's the wrong word. But the human rights structure, the whole idea of human rights, right? Because it's really hard to implement all of it all at the same time. And you do need to make choices. But what undermines the effectiveness of the systems is the fact that that political will doesn't exist sometimes at all, and that the structures that we have to try to enforce and implement human rights at the regional and the global level and even at the national and subnational level are all based on political will. And where does political will come from? A lot of times it comes from the fact that there's a political impetus to actually make human rights the front of mind in political agendas. And where does that come from? It comes from all of you. It comes from all of us. And if we don't have human rights education and we're not using human rights as the frame, we don't understand that we actually do have binding obligations, then we're not forcing our government to both implement human rights here at home and to have human rights in the forefront of our foreign policy agenda. So it all links together, and it all comes back to us too.
Yeah, just let me chime in here. You mentioned the politics, including the politics behind naming these independent experts on these committees and these special rapporteurs. It's the intergovernmental bodies like the Human Rights Council, which is made up of states, the United States among others, that appoint these independent experts, including the special rapporteurs, among them the special rapporteur on indigenous peoples, the position I held for some time. I just want to let you all know that the U.S. opposed my appointment as special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. And that's why I actually was appointed, because Mexico and others said, well, this guy must be independent of the U.S. if if his own country is opposing him. Anyway, just wanted to make sure that was out there.
It's a reality.
Yeah, Rowena, yes, please.
Okay, thank you so much. So first of all, I would like to follow up with Sarah's important point about the universal, human rights is universal, because the Chinese government has been playing this China exceptionism card for a long time, and saying that we are different, we have a different cultural background, we have different Asian values. That's why human rights means us, it's just to feeding the people, and they don't want the other rights. So it's just like we are animals, we just need to be fed. But I think that human rights is actually universally important. It's not just for particular countries. I think there's a danger when we do not recognize the universality of human rights, because very often I notice that in this country, on one side you would feel that I'm supporting those who are the weak, and they perceive those who are not American as the weak. They will feel, okay, the American government is criticizing this government, then they are the weak. But the Chinese government is not the weak. The people are the weak. The people who are being silenced and the weak. And even those who appear to support the Communist Party, they are the weak because they're victims of the centrally controlled system that use centrally controlled education, centrally controlled media to instill certain values and perspective, explaining to them what the world is like. For example, when the beginning of the Ukraine war, the kids in kindergarten and elementary school, they were being told that it's a just war, right? Because Ukraine was not grateful to Russia's support. I think that public opinion about democratization and nationalism and all of these important issues are closely connected to people's collective memory of the past of the world and the past of the nation. And when the regime have that control of the narrative by taking away people's rights to be informed, access of information through the control of internet and education. So the implications is profound, because citizens understand their responsibilities for the world by debating the moral meaning of history, by debating what happened in the past. When you take that away, when you take that basic rights to access to information, many dangerous things would happen. And I mentioned only one side, so the sympathetic one. And on the other side, you saw all this China threat, because the other narrative would be like, okay, these are all threatening to us, so we should just shut down and close up and don't have anything to do with them. And it never works, right? You cannot just shut down everything and don't talk to them. I think a democratic China is the solution. Not a war, but of course the CCP wanted to start a war, then we would have to deal with it. But that's one thing. And then maybe the second part was about what can we do. I grew up without ever giving the chance to contribute to what the society is going to happen. We tried once in 1989, and we were punished severely. And I tried the second time as a historian, and I'm now being exiled. So it's very different that you understand the political exile that you study, and to be exiled with 2 suitcases, not knowing where you would be next year, and whether you are going to be homeless tomorrow. So with that kind of punishment, the only thing I know is what I can do to change the world with as little as I can. You got Gorbachev, you got Putin. It's not up to me. But I know that I would just have to continue. Be informed, be attentive, but don't just be politically, superficially correct and say this and say that and brutalize and radicalize each other. Come and talk like today. Listen to each other. Speak with the possibility of being heard and listen with the possibility of being changed. And that's how we would eventually preserve democracy. And don't let those dictators use democracy to undermine democracy in this country. Thank you.
Important point there. We each have a role, and we have a couple of questions from a couple of students along those lines. One, what can the average person do to advance human rights in different countries of the world, not just one's own country? That's, I believe, the sense of the question. And then another related question, how do young people in particular how are young people able to advance human rights in their own countries? So what can the average person do to advance human rights around the world, and what can young people in particular do to advance human rights in their own countries? Yeah.
There are a lot of answers to this question. It depends on who you are, what your means are, where your reach is, what you're interested in. But I would say for young people, go into human rights work, also because I want to retire, like at some point, and I would really like a bench of people who can take this over. I mean, I think for all of us in this country, it's about voting. It's about having civil discourse. It's about getting human rights on the election agenda. Reproductive rights are going to be on the agenda naturally, or not naturally, but because of things that have happened. That's one form of rights. There are all of these other rights, domestically, but also internationally. And I hope that not only in the presidential election, but in the state and local elections, we will all be asking at the debates, in letters to the editor, in op-eds, in whatever, in town halls, about what our candidates believe about human rights here at home, but also abroad, and what they think America's role in the world should be. Because there are a lot of candidates who will say they believe in human rights, but want to pull the United States and its efforts to promote human rights back into a cave.
We think about this question every single day, all of us, right? And we try to influence it and impact in it. Let me try that again. We try to influence and impact in a variety of different ways. Wow. And kind of through every conversation. I feel like every conversation I have with anybody about anything always kind of comes back to this question. When I started working as a human rights attorney or as a human rights activist before I went to law school, I was doing work over there. And I lived and worked in more than 25 different countries, working on human rights projects, rule of law projects, and I'm a deep believer in these treaties and in this structure, and spent a really lot of time focused on that in a wide range of countries. And over the past 15 to 20 years, I realized that this idea of American exceptionalism, like there are a lot of really important things in terms of the structures that we have in place in this country that are unique and that are different. And there are a lot of things that are really messed up in this country with regards to fundamental human rights issues. And I will tell you, Eleanor Roosevelt, God bless her, like she really helped move the process of the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights forward. And you know who was with her in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? The NAACP. And they played a great, really important role because they understood that if there was a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that was going to help Black people in this country who had been so oppressed and were continued to be oppressed. And that using a human rights frame, they were going to get out from under Jim Crow laws. They were going to get out from under all of these horrible abuses that they continued to experience. Well, they got back home and actually it was turned against them. And one of the reasons that the United States didn't immediately embrace some of the international human rights treaties was because the Southern senators didn't want to ratify treaties that would undermine their ability to discriminate and to continue to discriminate against Black people in their jurisdictions. That's a part of this story that's very important to understand and know. And the more that I kind of dug into all of this, the more that I realized that I couldn't, with good conscience, be doing human rights work over there. And this is before, the war in Iraq, and this was before a lot of the things that really undermined U.S. credibility in a significant way. I couldn't keep doing that work without doing that work here. So I think it's great for people to really want to engage around international human rights. We have all talked to a whole bunch of students here over the last few days. You know, I used to teach at American University, Washington College of Law, all the students that want to go into international human rights. And I always say to them, you can do that, but you got to do this too. You got to do this work too. And so voting, yes, but you need to make sure that everybody has the right to vote and that everybody's enfranchised and everybody has access, because that's being closed off, right? You need to know at the national and at the school board level, because what's happening in education, for those of you who've already heard me talk about this numerous times, right? With the banning of books, with the educational gag orders, educational intimidation bills, are fundamentally against the fundamental right of students and parents and families to get access to information and the right to education. So it starts at the local level, it goes to the national level, it goes to the international level, but we need to be very aware and engaged on every level in order to create that human rights culture that then manifests in political change.
Thanks.
Sorry, Paul.
Yeah, that's okay. So another student question, this one is specifically for Sarah. It's from a student veteran. He asks, or she asks, do you see a correlation between human rights and military conscription in your work? Is there a correlation? I understand the question to mean in those countries where there is the draft, so to speak.
It is possibly because I am on Sudafed for a sinus infection.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Is there a relationship between compliance with human rights and those and forcible or conscription in military service?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at that issue so much. I think I would consider it a human rights abuse to be conscripted into the military.
Right.
And certainly at some ages, you know, the one of the big reasons why the United States is not part of the Children's Convention is because the United States has a different understanding of what a child is, specifically because we want people of a certain age to be able to come into our military, and the rest of the world considers them children. So it's an interesting thing. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for that, but I'll
Right,
think
yeah.
about it.
Yeah, did want to raise that though. And then another question we have, really interesting. In your opinion, the panel's opinion, the movement for the right of nature, is that supportive of human rights more broadly, or is that apart from human rights? The rights of nature, the movement to recognize and advance the rights of nature. We see that, for example, in a number of constitutions, the Bolivian Constitution, the Ecuadorian Constitution, recognizes the rights of nature, and we even see litigation, New Zealand, for example, litigation on behalf of a river that was actually successful. So the rights of nature itself, is that a corollary to human rights? Well, okay, well, yeah, well, okay, well, I don't want to dominate the panel in any way, but I think it can be complementary, but I think it's worth seeing the rights of nature as distinct. Sometimes we see nature only to the extent that it benefits us, either aesthetically or otherwise. And I think this planet does have a life of its own that's distinct from human beings on it. We are interdependent for sure, but just as we are distinct, each one of us, and collectively as human beings, the natural world has a distinct life of its own that's worthy of protecting. And I think that's the philosophy behind the rights to nature movement. And I do think it's complementary to human rights. I think because of that interdependence, if we protect the planet, if we protect nature, we are protecting ultimately human beings. That's my perspective, but I would like to open it up to the panel if there's anybody else cares to chime in.
So I mean, I think that there's increasing awareness about that because of the discussions around climate change, but it is a distinct conversation. Right. I think it was during the pandemic, where you were looking at interesting things to go and spend your time listening to because you could access conversations that were going on anywhere in the world about any topic, including things that you really didn't understand what they were talking about. So there was a panel that I listened to about post-human human rights. And it kind of blew my mind away. I still don't 100% understand it, I will confess, and it was fascinating to think about it in terms of, and it was not AI oriented, it was about kind of this, can you explain it? It's like this integration of
Yeah, not quite. I can't quite understand it, but I think you're on the right track.
Yeah, it goes beyond just human rights, but
Right.
actually around nature and universal, like not universal like everybody, but like universal rights.
Universal rights that apply to the cosmos and to all of us in a very general
but
sense.
I feel like so why would we, speaking of colonialism, like why would we take our structure of human rights for humans and apply it to everything else in the universe? Like, how patronizing is that? I feel like there is a difference between human rights and protection. And what we are talking about at protection, appreciation, and respect. And I think those are the things that we're talking about with regard to the natural world that is distinct from human rights for humans.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly the way our laws treat nature. We're protecting nature, but this idea of rights of nature is to see nature as itself having human rights apart from the utility that they may have for us. And I have been skeptical myself, but in observing where this notion is important to people. For example, a river in New Zealand that is deemed to have a life of its own, not just its importance to the Maori people who care for it, but they regard it as having a life of its own. And I think it was quite remarkable to see that case being advanced. No, it's not a human. It's a natural being in its own right. Right. I mean, there is a danger here, though, if we start to promote alternative conceptions of rights to the exclusion or instead of human rights. When I was in Bolivia once, in my role as UN Special Rapporteur, I was stunned when I was met with several government officials who told me, we don't care about human rights, that's passé. We care about the rights of nature and the rights of the universe. I'm not capturing the terminology used, but it was a terminology that today I can't really remember, but it was something along those lines what Hadar you were talking about. And so in that sense, it can be a dangerous movement if it's seen as a displacement of human rights, so of a way for us to focus our energies instead of focusing on human rights. But go ahead.
But wanting to be clear that I don't think that anybody up here is saying that we should not be respecting and protecting nature.
Right.
And that nature, especially in the context of climate change, right, is not intrinsically linked to our ability to understand and apply and protect human rights. Sarah needs to run off to an airplane. Bye, Sarah.
Bye, Sarah. Unfortunately, Sarah has to go catch a plane, but we're very grateful for her participation. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I mean, but so, and I will say, because we haven't talked about climate change, although there might be a question about it, there's a lot of work being done and a lot of thinking being done about the human rights implications of climate change.
Right.
And they're very real ones around migration, around
The right to life.
the right to life, the right to food, the right to, wars that are inevitably already starting to break out, right, because of climate displacement. And it's very, very important as we talk about nature as a distinct set of rights, understanding though that climate is related but different and very intrinsic to our current and future discussions around realizing human rights.
There is certainly an interconnection. The European Court of Human Rights just earlier this week ruled in favor of plaintiffs who alleged that Switzerland was not doing enough to combat climate change. And that was a threat to the right to life and a breach of Switzerland's obligation to protect life under the European Convention on Human Rights. So we do see more and more this connection between human rights. And in fact, many of you may have been present at the conference we had here was it 2 years ago, 1 year ago, on human rights and climate change. Rowena, please.
Very quickly, I think the two rights are actually intertwined and related. Like I'm China specialist, so I talk about the China case. So if people who care about environment, so environmentalists in China, they would be punished, and if they push for some changes, then people cannot do anything. So I think by the end of the day, it comes back to basic rights for people, for students. Like students, you even would bring this question, right, and say that, okay, what about the environmental rights? You raise these questions. But in a country that if you bring up any questions, you'll be punished. And the people who try to resolve those environmental problems would be in the way, would become an obstacle of this rising China, bigger, broader narrative about this rising China. So those narratives would also be silenced, and people who brought up these questions would all be silenced. So by the end of the day, I think the human rights, the basic rights to speak, to think, to be critical thinkers, would eventually affect the environmental protection and everything, not just domestically in China, but globally.
Right, and so that is another human rights issue that we see throughout the world, that the problem of human rights defenders, those who defend human rights, those who defend the environment, being silenced and oppressed for their speech, for their advocacy. Right, murdered, yes, yeah, many places. And I think each of us knows specifically of people that we could name who have died because of their human rights advocacy. Just let me get in one other question. We have one about the relationship between science and technology and the defense of human rights or the enforcement of human rights. I think where we see that especially is in the climate space, where technology or science in particular is really informing us, is really the basis for understanding what is happening to the climate and the basis for understanding how human rights are presently threatened, how people already are suffering the consequences of climate change, and it's silence in that field that's allowing us to understand that in very specific terms. I want to give each of our panelists, remaining panelists, just maybe if you could each just take 1 minute, we're almost out of time, to just give a final comment.
We've got the good, the bad, and the ugly. But what I will say is from this conversation, I really do believe in the good as superseding the bad and the ugly. And the good can actually really help to solve some of that bad and ugly that's out there. Sarah said she wants to retire someday. I kept saying, I've said for my entire career that I've been trying to work myself out of a job. It hasn't worked very well. If anything, it's sort of a growth industry in terms of trying to protect and defend human rights. But it's a growth industry that requires not the human rights lawyers to do it, and not just the human rights activists to do it, but actually it's an imperative for each one of us to do it. And as we've talked about a whole wide range of human rights, right? Pick one, pick two, pick three, and engage around them.
Thanks. Rowena, just briefly, please.
Don't know where to start. I'm thinking that we are doing human rights now, right now. This morning, Irvin brought me coffee, and then she gave me a chance to come here to speak. And you are here to give me a voice. And this voice is not just my voice. I kept thinking that the only reason that I can keep going for 35 years, despite everything happened, was because I wanted to regain those voices of my peers, those young people who were violently silenced in 1989. And of course, so many of the ordinary people without names that were silenced during the Great Famine and all these atrocities. throughout this PRC history, and there are many more out there, of course. So I think listen attentively, be informed, engaged, and be responsible citizens before you jump to a conclusion and become irritated about what's happening. And I know this is a difficult battle that we are in, and whether human rights is getting better or worse, I do not know, but I know that history is in motion. What our future would be depends on what we do today, together, collectively. Thank you.
I can't think of a better note to end on. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thanks for joining us. Have a good afternoon.